The most powerful individual on earth is the President of the United States. During President Nixon's final year in office, long-standing concerns about his mental balance became widespread in Washington.
They told me the president had been drunk and ordered a nuclear strike, and then I saw the chairman of the Joint Chiefs commenting the same.
And his hands were shaking, visibly. And he said, "I've just come from the office of the Secretary of Defense." He wanted an agreement from the Joint Chiefs that nobody would take any action on the use of nuclear weapons without all of them agreeing to it.
The message had to be gotten through that there were not to be any extraordinary military measures that would be taken at anyone's behest.
This sounds like a banana republic I'm talking about. I'm talking about the United States of America.
This two-part Reputation special contains new revelations about one of the 20th century's most controversial politicians. Richard Nixon, 37th President of the United States, was born in 1913 and raised in this small house in California. His parents could not have been more different.
It's been assumed that the difference between my mother and my father in their personalities was reflected in my brother's behavior and reaction to certain situations. And that's probably true. My father was vociferous and very opinionated. His mind was made up. Don't confuse him with the facts. He was known to fly off the handle, and my mother was the one there to calm him down, and she was just always concerned about everybody's troubles, and great lady.
Nixon was utterly devoted to his mother, but he was shy with girls. When he was 16, he began to date Ola Florence Welch. When they quarreled, Nixon seemed unable to face her to make it up and would send letters.
Sometimes he would get upset over I wouldn't know what, and then he would write me a letter the next day saying he was sorry for the way he'd acted. So I don't know, I just wonder, I don't know all what went through his mind.
When they separated 6 years later, Nixon sent a final letter. In it, he called his mother a supreme ideal.
He just wrote to me and said that his mother was a woman that was a wonderful woman, and that in a way I was like her, and that he was forever grateful to his mother for how much she had done for him.
To his teammates on the Whittier College football squad, Nixon seemed like a loner.
He just drove constantly to be one of the guys, but he didn't want to spend any idle time just talking around like small groups would do sometimes. Just a little margin there someplace that he didn't quite fit.
Nixon was desperate to make the first team.
We weren't good enough or heavy enough to be the first team. That discouraged a lot of people, you know. They didn't have the fire to keep going. I'll give him credit. He didn't give up.
That same drive swept Nixon into politics. After a hard-fought campaign, he entered Congress in 1947. But life in the public arena was not easy for him.
Nixon was not gregarious, and he did not like to meet people he didn't already know. So for a politician, that is an unusual trait, and he had to become a politician by enormous self-discipline, and by, in some respects, acting against his nature, which was reclusive and studious.
I think he had politics in his blood, But I also think that his personality was one of some insecurity. And I believe he developed his leadership qualities and his desire to be in politics and government as a way to overcome those insecurities.
In 1940, Nixon married Pat Ryan. It was clear from the beginning that married life would come second to his political career.
And if there was anything she would have rather had, it would have been a quiet family life with their 2 daughters and grandchildren. But she knew he had to do these things. It was in his destiny, and his sense of mission just carried him right into it.
And I think you'll find that she's one of the best campaigners on record.
Well, I certainly will do all I can.
Republican hopes soar with the nomination of their 2 new standard bearers.
In the early 1950s, Nixon became Dwight Eisenhower's vice president.
When you're in a large crowd, you don't have to establish a direct relation with any one person. He did not feel as shy in front of a large crowd.
Ambition and hard work had made Nixon one of America's most high-profile public figures.
He had phenomenal discipline. This is one thing you've got to understand about this man, is the discipline. His self-discipline was awesome. He would give total attention to this, then he would turn and give total attention to that.
He worked so hard that he could stand up and speak without notes on any subject for 45 minutes.
But even in the early 1950s, people close to Nixon were becoming concerned about his unrelenting work rate. He was suffering from insomnia and back pain. A friend lent him a best-selling book called The Will to Live. The author was Dr. Arnold Hutschnecker, an Austrian émigré whose patients included the actress Elizabeth Taylor. The doctor had long been interested in how emotional disturbances affect health. Nixon was impressed by the book and arranged an appointment with the doctor at his practice in New York City.
She said that lately he is becoming a little nervous and sleep is not so good. So I gave him just a medical prescription and said, come back in 2 weeks, so he did.
In conversations with journalist Robin Swan in the 1990s, Dr. Hutschnecker talked more openly than ever before about his relationship with Richard Nixon. The doctor, now 102, has difficulty speaking. But their conversations back then were all taped.
At that point, Doctor was 95 years old. He shared with me his manuscript, a book he had been writing about Mr. Nixon, and told me that he felt that at this point he would be able to be more frank and more candid than he had been either in previous conversations or interviews about Mr. Nixon, or even in his own book.
Nixon had 5 appointments in 1952. As they spent time together, Hutschnecker began to feel that the vice president was suffering from depression as well as insomnia.
He wasn't psychotic, so he had no pathology. Right. But he had a good portion of neurotic symptoms.
But Nixon stopped the open appointments in 1955 when the doctor became a full-time psychotherapist. Being seen with Hutschnecker was too much of a political risk.
He had just started to build a relationship of trust. Now he said he could really tell me everything, and then I said, I'm doing this, and then people around him would just cry out, he cannot see him anymore. What's the shrink? My God, I think you're nuts.
By 1960, Nixon had won the Republican Party's nomination for the presidency.
At Chicago last July, Vice President Richard M. Nixon was viewed almost unanimously as the Republican Party's natural successor to Dwight D. Eisenhower.
His opponent was the Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy.
Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts capped a political career of 6 years in the House of Representatives and nearly 8 years in the Senate.
Typically, Nixon pushed himself to the limit by deciding to campaign in every state of the Union.
It started in August and continued clear through till the election day, and it was punishing all the way. It became particularly hard when he injured his knee in Greensboro, North Carolina, on the door of a convertible.
The knee became infected. Nixon was forced to enter hospital when his doctors told him he might lose the leg.
When he came out of the hospital, he had lost a considerable amount of weight, I'd say about 8 or 10 pounds, and his shirts didn't even fit him.
Still weak, Nixon went on air to debate Kennedy in the first live televised debate between presidential candidates. Millions watched.
The two of us rode over to the studio to do the debate, and as we got out of the car, he bumped his knee again and re-injured the knee, and so I could hear him wince vocally.
Mr. Vice President, you said it was... He had a hospital pallor, and naturally he had a very heavy beard. He did not use makeup. He just had a light powder put on his beard. The contrast between him and Senator Kennedy was striking. Senator Kennedy was fit, tanned, and our vice president looked like someone who had just got out of the hospital.
The debate damaged Nixon's image, and Kennedy eventually won the election by the very narrowest of margins. Nixon described this defeat in a book he wrote shortly afterwards. In it, Nixon presents himself as a fighter able to deal with extreme situations.
And he also wanted to make clear that yes, he was put through the ringer during those crises, but look at what he learned from them and how each one of those incidences educated him, made him a stronger and more intelligent politician.
However, Dr. Hutschnecker is said to have had concerns about Nixon's ability to deal with great pressure.
What Dr. Hutschnecker was saying was that Mr. Nixon sought out positions in which he would demand, great demands would be placed upon him and great stress would be placed upon him. But then, at the very height of the crisis, couldn't always be relied upon to be fully capable to deal with that crisis.
A California primary with national interest is the contest waged by former Vice President Nixon for the Republican nomination for governor. With his wife, Pat...
Determined to re-enter the political arena, Nixon ran for office again in 1962.
This is a critical race for Mr. Nixon. His political life hinges on his success in the race for the governorship.
A retired journalist who I became acquainted with in the early 1980s, Bill Van Petten, told me Nixon was drinking heavily during the campaign, and this was well known to the traveling press corps and his staff.
John Ehrlichman was a close aide of Nixon's. Before his death, he worked closely with a filmmaker, Mark Barnett.
When John would talk about Nixon's drinking, he said that it wouldn't take much to get Nixon high. 1 or 2 drinks would be it. He couldn't hold his liquor.
On election night in November, Nixon watched the results in his hotel room. By midnight, it was clear he would lose.
He'd been up all night watching the returns come in, and he'd been drinking, and he was not at his best. He was on his way from his room to the car, and he was going down a hallway, and he looked through a door, and here was Herb Klein having a press conference.
I heard applause going across the lobby, and I announced that he left the hotel. Next thing I knew, he was tapping me on the shoulder and taking over the microphone.
I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference.
That was a time when I think I saw my father coming out of my brother, reacting, well, you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, because that was the kind of thing my father would have said. The gracious reaction my mother might have had would have been just say, well, I wish the new governor well.
For once, gentlemen, I would appreciate if you would write what I'm saying.
His wife, Pat, bore the brunt of his disappointment.
You write it. He's the only
And Bill said at that time, that day, that next night, Nixon again was drinking, and he had badly beaten Pat Nixon. She had been beaten to such a degree that she then went into seclusion.
Later, Pat sought advice on a divorce from a lawyer, Waller Taylor.
He was the family lawyer in the early 60s, and he did mention this to me at one point. She had come to him and said she'd had her eyes blackened or an eye blackened or something, and wanted to find out what it would take to get a divorce. But as it seemed, that all passed.
Dr. Hutschnecker confided to one of his acquaintances that once again Nixon had turned to him for help.
He'd been advising or tending to the needs, the psychiatric needs of Richard Nixon. I said, my word, he must have a lot of troubles. He said, oh yes, he's got lots of emotional difficulties.
The Nixon marriage did survive, and throughout the 1960s Nixon worked on his political comeback. He was determined to run for president again in 1968. Nixon asked Ehrlichman and another key aide, Bob Haldeman, to work on his campaign. Ehrlichman agreed, but only on condition that Nixon promised to stop drinking.
They were the people who he felt could discipline the campaign and could discipline himself, because he knew where he would get too exhausted, or where he would lose his temper, or where sound and fury would overcome mind and discipline.
He wanted a filter, and it was then that I realized his painful shyness. He could blush, and this is a remarkable quality to encounter in a mature politician who's met everybody, done everything, and yet it was engaging because it showed you the vulnerability of this very sensitive human being who was trying to be something that he was not.
Nixon found campaigning very stressful.
I think there may have been some medication to reduce stress, or whatever they call them, tranquilizing and so forth.
The nighttime routine would be late at night, have a drink, take a sleeping pill, like most of us. Nixon would get on the phone, and to me, the conversations were marked by a kind of a drift into a strange and bothersome incoherence, because I would wonder whether the next morning there would be a news release indicating there was some problem in the campaign that he didn't make. He didn't go on to the next stop.
Thanks to a former Wall Street tycoon called Jack Dreyfus, Nixon began to take a new drug that year. Dreyfus was using his considerable wealth to lobby for wider use of Dilantin. Dilantin is only officially approved in the U.S. to treat epilepsy, but Dreyfus claims it can help with anger, stress, and depression.
And he said, could you give me some? And I said, well, it's a prescription medicine. You must get it from a doctor. And he said, well, the heck with the doctors. Anyhow, I gave him the bottle. The bottle contained 1,000 pills at that time. But I realized that if he's running for president, I suppose that if he wanted Dilantin, I could give it to him.
Nixon was already taking sleeping tablets. If Dilantin is taken in combination with these types of drugs or alcohol, or in the wrong dose, the result can be devastating.
You're talking about creating a disastrous situation of mixing drugs that enhance their effect, not knowing what amount you took, not being aware of the safe amount, and then all the side effects that could occur, the delirium, the psychosis, slurred speech, mental confusion.
As Election Day approached, rumors began to circulate that Nixon had been seeing a psychotherapist in New York. Reporters were soon on the trail of Dr. Hutschnecker.
John Ehrlichman confirmed to me before his recent death that he, with Haldeman, knew about Nixon's connection with the psychotherapist Hutschnecker, but were very concerned to minimize it. And as Hutschnecker himself put it, it was safer for a politician to be going to a whore than to be seen to be involved with a psychiatrist.
Nixon's press aide, Herb KLEIN, visited Hutschnecker to contain the story.
He told me that he had seen Nixon on a number of occasions. He'd come to Washington on some occasions. And that his concern, Nixon's concern, was depression, and that he was having trouble with insomnia.
I got in touch with Dr. Hutschnecker to try to interview him on this subject, and of course he wouldn't discuss Nixon per se, though he didn't deny having seen Nixon.
I think that we were ready with answering with the doctor saying that there was no psychological problem, which made it a small issue and short-lived.
But what he was at great pains to say was how important it was to have some kind of test or guidelines or notion of the emotional stability of our political leaders, and he was so impassioned about that that I read into that a concern about Nixon himself.
The press could not take the story any further, and Nixon went on to win the election by an extremely narrow margin. In January 1969, he was sworn into the most important and high-pressured job in the world.
Preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Nixon's first term in office was dominated by America's involvement in the Vietnam War. At the beginning of May 1970, it led to a major political and personal crisis.
Comes out right. If it comes out right, that's what really matters.
Gentlemen.
Days after he had spoken of bombs blowing up campuses, 4 student anti-war protesters were shot dead by troops controlling chaotic demonstrations at Kent State University.
When all hell broke loose, that affected him deeply. He was under strain. We were all under strain. He had fewer friends than many, so he had to face a lot of it alone.
Thousands descended on Washington in protest.
That weekend, Washington was an occupied city, and we had buses ringing, I think, the White House and several other buildings for protective purposes.
On the 8th of May, President Nixon had a sleepless night. Between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m., he made 46 phone calls, including one to White House correspondent Nancy Dickerson.
Nixon's mood on the telephone was disturbing, as my mother later described it. On the one hand, he was questioning, halting, unsure of himself. The next minute he was brave, in control. Another minute he was happy and delighted, another sorrowful and sad. In the conversation, Nixon ranged all over the map. He talked about foreign policy, talked about domestic policy, always circling back to those kids who were on the mall. He said, "I love those kids. I really do." And she said, "Well, why don't you go out and talk to them?" And he said, "Well, that's what I will do."
I was just in a state of absolute panic because he left the White House with a very small detail of Secret Service agents. And we just didn't have the capability to protect him if there had been any effort to move on his person.
Crow pursued Nixon and his valet Manolo Sanchez to the Lincoln Memorial, where he found the president talking to a large group of students.
I think we're almost speechless. They could hardly believe that he was actually there.
We couldn't make sense of what he was saying, but we picked up after a while that he was giving like a tour of the world. He was mentioning various countries, saying something about Prague, saying something about some cities in the United States. he just kept rambling, and he didn't cut off on one topic and then start another one. It was like his mind wasn't on anything at all. It was just like he was just going. He just kept going.
Then Nixon decided to take Manolo to the Capitol building and have the locked House chamber opened.
I remember going into the House chamber. I went up the stairs to look down from the balcony, and he was sitting on the front row, and he asked Manolo, who was his retainer, the person who was his valet, to go up and sit where the speaker would sit. And he said, well, say something, Manola. And Manola said something, and the president applauded. And I looked down on this tableau thinking, this is very bizarre.
Bob Haldeman wrote in his diary that Nixon is not getting enough sleep, is uptight, can be rough if another crisis arises because he's not ready to handle it. A few days later, Nixon flew down to rest at a friend's house in Florida. He needs it, wrote Haldeman. In Florida, he saw Dr. Hutschnecker.
At the time, as I recall, the Hutschnecker told me that he'd been called down to B.B. Rebozo's place in Florida. And he went down there because he felt that Nixon needed him. Nixon couldn't turn to anybody else, even if he wanted to.
However finely tuned his nervous balance might be, at the end, he always got the situation under control.
4 months later, Nixon was again under pressure. Palestinian terrorists hijacked several aeroplanes and made them land in the desert in Jordan. Nixon made the questionable decision to retaliate by bombing a Jordanian airfield.
Conveniently, there was bad weather. I've always tried to carry out the orders of the Commander-in-Chief, but on some occasions, it was better to kind of protect him too. And the bad weather just came about at the right time.
This was not the first time that excuses were made to avoid carrying out the president's orders. The year before, Palestinians had hijacked a passenger plane and flown it to the Syrian capital, Damascus.
Mr. Nixon apparently called Henry Kissinger, 3 o'clock in the morning. Henry, yes, Mr. President. And the president said, Henry, I want to set in motion plans for bombing of Damascus. This is an order. This is not something for discussion. He said, yes, Mr. President, I understand. Now, go back to sleep and I will set this in motion. So the president went back to sleep because nothing was done.
It was one of these things which he would probably have been horrified if it had been carried out. It was sort of posturing for people that he was with that evening.
In June 1972 came the event that would lead to Richard Nixon's downfall. Burglars linked to the White House were arrested in Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building. Within days, Nixon, Haldeman and Ehrlichman embarked on a cover-up to protect the presidency. The incriminating conversations were captured on tape by the White House recording system. For a while, the cover-up succeeded, and in 1972, Nixon was re-elected with an overwhelming majority. But there was little time for celebration. Day by day, revelation followed revelation.
It was the single most heavily covered story in the entire history of the Republic. And it was all heavily anti-us. It was a constant pounding and pounding and pounding.
By April 1973, the trail had reached back to the highest levels of the White House. Nixon decided he would have to sacrifice Haldeman and Ehrlichman. He broke the news to them in person at Camp David.
Camp David was the low point of his presidency, and I think the low point of his life, when he had to step up to the fact that the next day he had to call these men in and tell them both that they had to leave.
His eyes were red-rimmed. He was genuinely sobbing, and so was I. It was the end of a long association.
I had never seen him so distraught. He was in his study, just completely lifeless. He turned to me then and he said, "Do you think I should resign?"
And he had had a few drinks, but he just had to kill the pain that he felt in taking that step.
Today, in one of the most difficult decisions of my presidency, I accepted the resignations of two of my closest associates in the White House, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, two of the finest public servants it has been my privilege to know.
Later that evening, Nixon phoned Haldeman. Their conversation was recorded on the White House tapes.
I hope I didn't let you down. No, sir. You got your points over, and now you got it set right and move on. Right where you ought to be. Well, it's a tough thing, Bob, for you, for John, the rest, but goddammit, I'm never going to discuss this son of a bitching Watergate thing again. Never, 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 never. Don't you agree? Yes, sir. But let me say, you're a strong man, goddammit, and I love you. And I love John. We're all the rest, and by God, keep the faith.
And that was another traumatic time for him, for sure. It was loss of a defense, a surrounding fence, so to speak, keeping the dogs out of the yard.
A former Secret Service employee who has requested anonymity observed the impact of Watergate on the president.
Nixon wasn't doing well under the stress and pressure, and he became increasingly paranoid. It wore on his face. You could see it. He wasn't what we call a classic alcoholic, but when he did drink on a few occasions, he would drink to excess and become rather ugly. And there were 2 or 3 incidents in his career, one of which I was aware of, that he got a bit physical with his wife. Her doctor would reveal that there was damage, facial damage. That's all I can really go into.
We now know that, as Watergate began to overwhelm him, Nixon received a visit from Jack Dreyfus, who gave him a fresh supply of Dilantin, another 1,000 tablets.
And as I was leaving, he said, "You better leave that bottle with me." Some people are more high-strung than others, and he said it helped him with his stress. But I didn't go into details. You know, you don't ask those questions of a president.
In May 1973, with Nixon increasingly isolated and under attack, Dr. Hutschnecker called to express his concern. Nixon's secretary knew she should not log the call. "I won't put it in a memo," she said. In July, the doctor sent a letter to Nixon offering his help.
While on the one hand trying to get in touch with Nixon privately, Hutschnecker did something quite remarkable publicly. He wrote an article published in the New York Times in which, naturally without mentioning Richard Nixon, he wrote a thinly veiled piece stressing his view, which was that before being elected to high office, U.S. leaders should be examined and given a clean bill of psychiatric health as well as a clean bill of physical health.
Now the press were beginning to speculate openly about the president. At an August press conference, a reporter asked Nixon about his capacity to govern.
I was elected to do a job. Watergate is an episode that I deeply deplore, and had I been running the campaign rather than trying to run the country, and particularly the foreign policy of this country this time, it would never have happened. But that's water under the bridge. It's gone now. The point that I make now is that we are proceeding as best we know how to get all those guilty brought to justice in Watergate. But now we must move on from Watergate to the business of the people. And the business of the people is continuing with the initiatives we began the first administration.
By autumn 1973, the Nixon White House was under siege once again. Protests grew, and Congress began to talk of impeachment, forcing the president from office. At this point, war broke out in the Middle East, and it seemed the Soviets might intervene. But Nixon was absent from the midnight meeting, which put U.S. forces onto heightened alert.
The key recommendation was made in his absence, and preliminary steps were probably taken in his absence.
The president was in the residence, and General Haig, who was then chief of staff, would disappear from the Situation Room where we were sitting.
I spoke to the president both before, during, and after that meeting. He was wide awake, sober, and fully in control of his own faculties.
But Kissinger has written in his book, Years of Upheaval, that the president had been agitated and emotional that day. Nixon had retired to bed at 9 p.m.
I felt that it was unusual that he should be absent throughout what was a major point of confrontation between ourselves and the Soviet Union.
The next day, Nixon gave a press conference.
Well, those who saw me during the Middle East crisis thought I bore up rather well. And, Mr. Turhorst, I have a quality which is, I guess I must have inherited it from my Midwestern mother and father, which is that the tougher it gets, the cooler I get.
The anecdotals related to me by battle staff team members in proximity to the president at that moment in the White House was apparently that the president was highly inebriated during this period, and there was great concern as to his mental faculties to make these decisions while this nuclear weaponry was being rattled.
By early 1974, calls for the president's impeachment were growing, and Nixon was battling to keep the courts from obtaining the White House tapes, which would prove he was lying about Watergate.
In life generally, and in politics particularly, you don't win them all. I'm an expert on that. And also, you never win even when you win big and just assume, well, now the job is done, because the battle always goes on. That's our system. That's the way it should be. You learn from your defeats, and then you go on to fight again. Never quit. Never quit. Always go on and fight for those things you believe in. Keep your faith, keep your confidence.
He said to me, I'm going to do as much as I can in the time I have left. And he did accomplish some things, particularly in the Middle East. The first president to visit Israel, the first president to visit Syria.
In Egypt, he seemed to court danger in front of huge crowds. Secret Service agents felt he was virtually inviting an assassination attempt. He was also in pain from phlebitis, a potentially life-threatening inflammation of the vein in his left leg.
I was very, very concerned about that because the man was conscious about 18 hours a day and constantly fretting over the situation, and that couldn't but concern anyone about his health, and I was very concerned about that.
Back in Washington, the president continued to behave strangely.
I was walking up the stairway in the west wing of the White House when suddenly somebody came down the stairs two at a time and bowled me over. And he was followed by 6 other people. I suddenly realized, my God, that was the President of the United States and running away from 6 Secret Service agents. And the look in his eye was one of desperation, and that bothered me.
There was even concern that the president or White House staff might try to ring the White House with troops.
And about that time, my Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, Joe LAITIN, came to the office.
And I said, if I were in your place, I would want to know what the nearest combat-ready troops were that would take orders directly from the President and not bother with the chain of command.
The nearest troops were stationed just 3.5 miles from the White House.
He looked with concern at the Marine barracks just on the outskirts of Washington. He also looked at the 82nd Airborne, crack troops based in North Carolina, and he was told that they could be operational in Washington within about 5 hours. I understand Schlesinger has said that the very idea of having one set of American troops around the White House and having to bring in other troops to counter them would have been, in his words, a bloody mess.
An unprecedented order was issued. Defense Secretary Schlesinger wanted to ensure that no extraordinary instructions to the military would be carried out.
I told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that every order that would come from the White House had to come to me directly, immediately upon receipt.
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs called a meeting of the Joint Chiefs, and his hands were shaking visibly. And he said, I've just come from the office of the Secretary of Defense. He wanted an agreement from the Joint Chiefs, all of them, that nobody would take any action or execute orders, as they call it, on the use of nuclear weapons without all of them agreeing to it. And we were shocked. He said, but we all agreed.
We would receive countersigned, top-secret, eyes-only, limited distribution messages stating that we should not obey orders until further notice.
In a situation this tragic and this volatile and this emotional, all sorts of speculation and stability rumors can spread. I believe it was inappropriate for Secretary Schlesinger to issue such an order.
The President was the duly elected man in office, and it is not the responsibility of his cabinet officers to question whether or not he's balanced, save when there is clear evidence that he is no longer capable of the job.
At the end of July, it became clear that Nixon would have to resign or face impeachment. In his last days at the White House, some feared that he might attempt suicide.
The president was in a very difficult position. His health had been affected. He said to me, you know, Al, in the old days and in your profession, the visitor would leave a pistol in the desk drawer, and he knew what would happen with that pistol.
Haig ordered the president's doctors to remove any pills he might have.
I don't think anyone other than his immediate family, his wife and his children, understood as I did the strains that he was under and the pressures he was facing as he approached a decision to resign.
I think that he gradually buckled under that stress. I was amazed at the end that he was able to continue his life through the end of the presidency.
Everything he had worked for all his life was collapsing, and deep down he knew that he had made a big contribution to its collapse.
So they walk in and the staff is drenched in tears. It's all over. And Mrs. Nixon stood next to her husband and the 2 daughters and the sons-in-law. And throughout his speech, which is about as impassioned as I've ever heard a president, I mean, it came right from the soul, the gut, the heart. He mentioned his mother, sainted mother, his father.
But he was a great man. Because he did his job, and every job counts, up to the hilt, regardless of what happened. Nobody will ever write a book, probably, about my mother. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint.
He just got carried away, and everything thrust back to, I tried so hard for the country.
When you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes, because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
There were several times when he almost broke down, but each time he gathered his strength and he went on and through to the end. I kept hoping, I was sitting in the front row, I kept hoping that he would make it through to the end. He finally did.
I think history will echo the view that he was a very complicated man with great talent, who was not a natural politician, who steeled himself in the quest for higher office, and those talents were accompanied by great flaws.
President Nixon called me into his private cabin on Air Force One. And he said, well, we did some good things, but I let my country down, I let my family down, and I let myself down. And the tragedy is there's no going back. And he just turned and looked out the window for the longest period of time, and nothing else was said.
You can see the concluding part of Reputations at the same time, 9 o'clock next Monday here on BBC Two.